Evening and welcome to tonight's talk in a series Elephant in the Room, exploring the future of museums. This is our fourth talk in a series in this program, but our first talk in the new year. So happy and healthy new year, and thank you for being here. The Elephant Lecture Series was organized by the Stuart Swift Research Center of the Henry Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, Vermont. My name is Eva Garcelon-Hart, and I'm the archivist here at the center. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting this program from Dakina, the ancestral homeland of Abenaki peoples, past and present. The Elephant in the Room Lecture Series program was conceived to engage community members and foster conversation between the public and us, curators and archivists, about past and present collecting and exhibiting practices, so we can learn how to better serve our changing demographics with an eye on race, gender, and class. This year also, in 2022, we will be celebrating 50th anniversary of our archives, Stuart Swift Research Center. Although we have this fabulous, rich, and voluminous collection, we wonder how well this collection reflects our community, our past communities. And because the collection was assembled by our tireless collector, Henry Sheldon, during the last part of 19th century, and obviously he reflected his own point of view while collecting it. So this is a great opportunity for us to reflect what collections like ours are really telling us about our past, who they reflect, who was omitted, who was obscured, and perhaps we can learn from each other how to better interpret objects in our collections and really create exhibits with an eye of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so all of us in a community can feel welcome when we come to museums or examine our archival collections. We very much welcome any comment and question from the public, so please feel free to type any of your inquiries. There is a box, Q&A, to the right side of bottom of your screen. And my colleague Taylor Rossini will moderate the discussion after the talk. Also, I would like to remind you that we still have several of talks in the series. On February 9 at the same time, the same place, Christine De Lucia will talk about historical maps. Coincidentally, we have a sizable collection of old maps in our archives, so we are all looking forward to this next talk and hope that you can join us. I wanted to thank the Vermont Humanities for its generous support of this series, and also for additional support from Dinse law firm for today's talk. Thank you very much to both. If you feel so inclined, we welcome any donations that they will support future programming by Sheldon Museum. So please don't hesitate to click on a link in a donation box in our Q&A box. But all our talks are free and open to everybody. So only if you feel so, we would very much appreciate it. Today, our speaker is Michelle Smiley. Dr. Smiley is a historian of 19th century photography and American science. I lost my biography, but I remember. She received her PhD in history of art from Bryn Mawr College and is currently an affiliated scholar with the Center for Cultural Analysis at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Her most recent projects examine the history of daguerreotype in antebellum United States and how the objects and processes of photography came to be viewed as democratic media. Thank you for your attention and enjoy the evening. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you both to Eva and Taylor for organizing this event and inviting me to speak this evening. And thank you so much to everyone in the audience for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick content note to say this talk will deal with some images related to the history of slavery and scientific racism in the United States. So, throughout the same decades during which the daguerreotype remained the most popular form of American photography, spanning roughly from the medium's invention in 1839 and lasting until just about the eve of the American Civil War, the United States became a site of experimentation in both the political and scientific senses. Technical innovations in photographic technology emerged alongside the violent Western expansion of American territory, battles for expanded suffrage, extractive mining projects, radical abolitionism, and the contested spread of the plantation slavery system. By the 1840s, the increasingly multiracial country produced a split consciousness in what was understood to be the nature of American democratic government, a fissure described later by W.E.B. Du Bois as a contest between racial slavery democracy and abolition democracy. New figures in scientific reform, many of whom were intimately involved in the daguerreotype's introduction to the US, began to advocate for the teaching and production of so-called useful knowledge, meaning innovations designed to harness and develop the country's natural resources. At the same time, anti-slavery activists like Frederick Douglass extolled the virtues of the new medium of photography, along with the railroad and the telegraph, as key means by which enslaved subjects could ultimately facilitate their own freedom. In all of these ways, the daguerreotype, in its modes as both an art of self-representation and as an instrument of technical experimentation, united the realms of aesthetics, politics, and science. My talk this evening will focus on the daguerreotype to consider how portrait photographs, both the images and their production, intersected with the social and visual construction of racial identity. From the pseudoscience of physiognomy to the social codes of conduct in the photographer's receiving room, to the choice of props and pose, the daguerreotype studio became a site in which politics, art, and science converged to create a place where photographers and sitters, particularly those who were barred from the traditional arenas of political life, participated in a kind of visual politics of representation. Before going too much further down this line of inquiry, it may be helpful to first ask, what is a daguerreotype and how is it made? Made public as a discovery of the French artist and entrepreneur Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre in January of 1839, the daguerreotype is an early form of photography consisting of a process whereby a sheet of finely polished copper is coated with a thin layer of silver, which is sensitized through exposure to iodine and then placed directly in a camera. The camera holding the sensitized plate is then placed in front of an object or sitter, after which the lens is removed and an image of the scene is captured on the metallic surface. Afterwards, the plate is taken back to be developed with mercury fumes and fixed with a solution of hypo. The final image is then fitted into a velvet-lined case and placed under glass, protecting it from the degrading effects of air. The result is a direct positive image, meaning that the photograph is produced without the aid of a negative. Through this process, every image captured in daguerreotype form is unique and cannot be replicated without actually rephotographing the resulting image. So because the daguerreotype is a direct positive, each image that you see represents an object that was physically present with the pictured subject at the time of exposure. Take, for instance, this daguerreotype of Fanny Smith from around 1855, an object held in the collection of the Henry Sheldon Museum. To hold such an object in the hand is to be with a physical artifact once present with the pictured sitter. The effect of immediacy, of the sitter reaching across time to be present with us through the magic of Daguerrean technology, is nothing short of remarkable. However, in 1839, when Daguerre first announced his discovery, he imagined the process might never be suitable for portraiture. This was due to the lengthy exposure times that early versions of the process required, which could go upwards of 20 minutes, entirely too long for any sitter to remain perfectly still in front of the camera. Yet such limitations would not remain true for long. After the announcement of the discovery of this new means by which images could be painted by light, news of the daguerreotype quickly crossed the Atlantic. What happened next would inaugurate a sea change not only in the visual culture of the antebellum United States, but also in the history of photography writ large. Representative of the speed and agility with which American practitioners took up and started experimenting with the new medium was the Philadelphia metallurgist Robert Cornelius. In 1839, Cornelius was working as a lamp maker at his father's factory. With his chemical training and expertise in metallurgy, around September or October of 1839, Cornelius stepped into his backyard at 710 Chestnut Street, where he would take what is now recognized as the world's first self-portrait photograph. After this accomplishment, it wouldn't take long until Cornelius opened one of the world's first commercial photography studios, which he ran with the Philadelphia chemist Paul Goddard as his silent partner. Cornelius's self-portrait was effectively a reinvention of the medium itself, transforming it from a slow process and scientific curiosity into a relatively instantaneous medium, making the daguerreotype viable as a means of producing commercial portraits. In the 5 decades following its invention, portraits made up over 90% of all photographic images produced in the 19th century United States. The commercial explosion of Daguerrean portraiture has led many to attribute the medium with the democratization of the elite practice of self-representation, formerly practiced through the more expensive and time-consuming medium of painted portraiture. As Ralph Waldo Emerson observed in 1841, the daguerreotype represented the first truly Republican style of painting, where the artist stands aside and lets you paint yourself. Yet, as you may have already guessed, there is much more to the story than simply the wholesale expansion of the new medium of lens-based portraiture to the masses. What was democratic about the daguerreotype, a quality that period commentators attributed to the medium's cheapness and ubiquity, also came along with a host of gendered and racialized representational practices. By the middle of the 19th century, the daguerreotype, in its new uses as a medium of portraiture, would come to intersect with the contradictory motivations and practices of both abolitionist and pro-slavery activists. To illustrate this history, I will look at 2 different kinds of photographic portraiture practiced in the antebellum US, 2 genres that, as I hope to show you, may have more in common than at first meets the eye. The first of these categories we might loosely label ethnographic photography, in which a sitter is photographed in profile and/or facing towards the camera in an effort to accurately record his or her morphological features. This type of image would become used in anthropometry by the photographer John Lamprey, who in the 1870s advocated for the use of this set of poses against a gridded backdrop to facilitate anatomical comparisons. Throughout the 19th century, such images, carefully constructed in pose and framing, were frequently used as visual evidence for the racial inferiority of non-white peoples. The earliest and one of the most notorious examples of this type of photograph can be found in the Agassiz collection of Harvard University's Peabody Museum. In 1850, the Harvard anatomist Louis Agassiz likely commissioned a set of daguerreotypes of 7 enslaved Black men and women in frontal and profile views. Now commonly referred to as the Zeiley daguerreotypes, after the photographer J.T. Zeiley, the archive consists of 15 images of Alfred, Fassina, and Jem, Renty and his daughter Delia, and Jack and his daughter Drana, whose images were recorded without the sitter's consent in Zeilia's Columbia, South Carolina photography studio. The daguerreotypes remain a haunting testament to the long-lasting impact of Agassiz's theories of scientific racism, as well as each sitter's enduring personhood under the horrific conditions of enslavement. As others have pointed out about these images, part of what is so unsettling about them is the apparent discrepancy between the treatment of these subjects as scientific specimens and the fact they were taken in a commercial photography studio. The kind of carved wood and furniture and plush carpets common in daguerrean establishments are in fact visible in some of the full-length daguerreotypes captured by Zeiley. Seen in these velvet-lined cases and gold decorative frames in which they were originally housed, to 21st century eyes, these images display an unsettling contrast between science and sentiment, where a human framed as an anthropological specimen is encased in the same manner as a precious family memento. These are reminders of the second genre of photograph we might refer to as the vernacular or everyday portrait. This second category of images are notable less for their exceptional status as proto-anthropological artifacts than for their sheer ubiquity. Such images can be found in almost any archive, including the Sheldon Museum, such as this tintype of an unknown woman. The tintype, much like the daguerreotype, was also a unique positive image captured on metal, essentially a cousin of the process, but produced with the cheaper and lighter materials of iron and metal lacquer. In this image, the sitter, unlike the men and women pictured in the Zeiley daguerreotypes, is seen with identifying markers of family, including a brooch with an image of a loved one pinned at the collar of her dress. Such attributes remind us of the portrait's function to act as a memento and strengthener of social and familial bonds, and as reminders of loved ones separated by distance or time. In this sense, the daguerreotype was indeed, as Emerson called it, a Republican style of painting, both immensely cheaper and faster to produce than a traditional painted portrait. Yet the democratic nature of the medium as a means to fairly represent and capture the likenesses of any average American was underwritten, or we may even say haunted, by images like those taken by Zeiley. When considering that these two kinds of images were taken in nearly identical studio settings, we may come to see that what was democratic about the daguerreotype was not an inherent attribute of the technology itself. Rather, all came down to use. So what, if anything, might an image like this one, so commonly found within photography archives, have to teach us about the history of race in the antebellum US? To answer this question, it's important to understand the everyday practices of a studio daguerreotypist around 1850. Throughout the early 1840s, early practitioners like Cornelius would use their skills in metallurgy and chemistry to make a tidy profit selling daguerreotype portraits to a growing commercial market. By 1843, Cornelius would close his commercial studio to return to the more profitable business of selling gas lamps. Yet the production of portraits would continue to grow exponentially. By 1846, Philadelphia alone housed approximately 16 daguerreotype businesses, a number that would grow almost tenfold over the following 10 years, when more than 113 galleries were recorded as selling daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and paper photographs. By 1850 in New York City, there were 70 recorded functioning daguerreotype studios, while these numbers also continued to rise in cities like Baltimore and Cincinnati, as well as outside of metropolitan areas. Significantly, the explosion in the market for photographs and photographic portraits in particular led to a shift in the perception of the daguerreotypist from an image of an artisanal tinkerer exemplified by Cornelius to what we might call a professional photographer, meaning someone who conducted their photography business, as their main source of income. Part of this transformation, which started around the mid to late 1840s, entailed the distancing of daguerreotypy from its roots in artisanal handwork and manual labor. This was a distancing in perception, if not in actual fact. As a result, daguerreotype studios started to look less like scientific laboratories and more like a cross between a living room parlor and a commercial art gallery. The change was part of a larger development and definition of middle-class jobs at mid-century, which came to encompass a kind of labor defined as non-manual and requiring some degree of formal education. One important component of this new perception of the art of photography as a skilled, non-manual art, again, just perception, not an actual fact, relied on the discourse of physiognomy. Loosely described, physiognomy refers to the interpretation of the outer features of a sitter's appearance for evidence of their internal character or personality. The practice had been around since the time of Aristotle, but had more recently experienced a revival in the late 18th century thanks to its popularization by the Swiss pastor Johann Caspar Lavater. By the 19th century, physiognomy stood as one of a growing number of sciences that sought to interpret the visible signs of the natural world for clues to invisible causes. Other such practices included phrenology, craniology, ethnology, as well as other natural scientific pursuits like the investigations of the invisible causes of phenomena such as light, heat, air, and magnetism. Part of this scientific and cultural shift toward reading the signs of the visible for the invisible, physiognomy emerged as a key word used by portrait photographers to describe the unique skill required to produce a quality likeness. As a photographer wrote under the pen name Justice in 1854, capturing an accurate portrait required first visually scanning the human character. This photographer sees it as his job to read the mind of his sitters so he can divine the subject's true character and then find the correct pose, framing, and lighting to best capture this personality in a photograph. For example, in his 1864 text, The Camera and the Pencil, the photographer Marcus Aurelius Root describes the type of portrait pose most suitable for ladies, writing, "The hands of a lady may rest easily upon the lap and should be presented edgewise, neither too high nor too low, which will give them a small, delicate appearance. Or one hand or arm may be laid upon a table while the other hand may hold a book or some other object if the sitter so choose. For myself, however, I think a pretty hand is much the prettiest when empty." In such cases, we can see an understanding of the photographer's ability to actively construct the image he saw fit for his subject, while at the same time advertising his ability to reveal the fixed character that was supposedly inherent in the subject. In essence, fixing someone's portrait would also visibly fix his or her character for all to see and to examine for themselves. Something that, as we will see, the professional photographer shared with the racial scientists of the same period. Such uses of physiognomy, which in fact describes a host of heterogeneous practices and theories, were deployed by a diverse range of practitioners outside of the photographer's studio. Self-styled scientists, showmen, and artists drew upon the loose set of theories of reading the outer face for signs of inner character at a time when intensive efforts at nation building provoked legal, social, and visual negotiations of precisely who counted as an American citizen and what that looked like. Such conversations intensified around 1850, not least of all due to the passage by Congress of the Fugitive Slave Act. With this new statute, enslaved subjects who'd escaped and made the dangerous trip into free territory in the North could be lawfully hunted down and returned to their owners in the slave states. It was this new jurisdiction that crossed state borders that made the issue of slavery one of national importance and radicalized many abolitionists who started calling for the total removal of the slave system in lieu of gradual emancipation, which was promoted by other anti-slavery advocates. The Fugitive Slave Act also might be said to intersect with our previous discussions of physiognomy, as the surveillance of non-white peoples only intensifies as slave catchers went hunting for fugitives to return for monetary reward. With this political backdrop in mind, the practices of the photographer who scanned each sitter's outer features for inner character echo outside of the daguerreotype studio. Along these lines, in 1854, Josiah Knott and George Glidden published an infamous illustrated book titled Types of Mankind, in which physiognomic interpretations were used as the explicit basis for the justification of a quote unquote natural basis for the institution of slavery. In this case, we see how the use of physiognomic rhetoric in advertisements and manuals by daguerreotypists at the same moment had direct implications for the perpetuation of the institution of slavery. This indeed was the sometimes explicit and sometimes implicit goal of several comparative anatomists, including the mentor of Knott and Glidden, Samuel George Morton. In the second quarter of the 19th century, Morton, who was a colleague of Louis Agassiz, practiced his own pseudoscience of craniology, which he pioneered in his 1839 publication, Crania Americana. In this text, Morton argues that the volumetric capacity of the skull was directly correlated with the state of civilization and hence humanity of that race. While Morton's theories were, even at the time, effectively debunked, he would have a lasting impact on both the history of photography and the history of American science through his concept of polygenesis, a theory of human creation in which the 5 races of humankind, as identified by Morton, constituted altogether separate species. In essence, Morton and later Agassiz, through these ideas, sought to prove the inhumanity and inferiority of the non-white peoples. While Morton's publications were illustrated with lithographs taken from engravings and sketches of his skull collections, there is one daguerreotype that the craniologist likely commissioned as part of his investigations. In 1848, Morton accompanied a young man around 18 years of age to sit to have his daguerreotype portrait taken by the Philadelphia firm of William and Frederick Langenheim. At the time, the Langenheim brothers owned and operated one of the most successful portrait studios in the city out of the Market Exchange building. The result was this image. The sitter's name was recorded as Dudu Unque on the back side of the plate, and he proves to be an exceptional subject for the Langenheim studio, which, as surviving records seem to indicate, served almost exclusively a white and upper and middle class audience. While we know very little biographic details about the sitter's personal history, we do know that he was transported under the so-called paternal auspices of United States Consul Captain Isaac Chase from the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to Philadelphia sometime around 1848. We also know that the portrait studio was not the only venue where the sitter was put on display for visual consumption. In the same year this image was taken, the craniologist Morton exhibited this young man as an ethnological specimen for a scientific audience at the Academy of Natural Sciences. A partial transcript of the proceedings of the February 1848 meeting provides some indication as to how Morton framed this sitter. The recorded text bears all the hallmarks of natural history writing of the time, with descriptions of the outer appearance of the skin, hair, and other bodily features, which Morton claimed to be representative of a particular racial type. This mode of display and intrusive inspection, however, does not seem to be evident in the daguerreotype itself, where the sitter is posed in a somewhat typical three-quarter view, head down, looking somber if uncomfortable in a schoolboy's uniform. So how do we know this image had anything to do with Morton's science of race? As the caption here indicates, this object is now held in the Peabody Museum, where it was discovered in the 1970s as part of the daguerreotype collection associated with the Swiss racial scientist Agassiz. With this in mind, I would guess that around 1848, Morton, who was a close friend and colleague of Agassiz's, likely sent this image to the Harvard racial scientist in the mail. To what purpose? We have no concrete archival evidence, but it's my suspicion this object may have been an inspiration for Agassiz to turn to the medium of photography as a new means of capturing and disseminating evidence for his theories of racial pluralism, which 2 years later resulted in the production of the infamous series of Zeile daguerreotypes. As referenced earlier, the anatomist received these disturbing and haunting series of photographs from the photographer Zeile in June 1850, after Agassiz had observed the enslaved workers on a local plantation at the invitation of the South Carolina naturalist Robert W. Gibbs. Looking at these daguerreotypes side by side, the notable difference in pose and the decision to strip Renty of his shirt illustrate the shift to a mode of picturing that today we might describe as scientific, or which we might also associate with the criminal mugshot. However, the exhibition of the Zeile daguerreotypes was at the time limited. As the scholar Molly Rogers has uncovered, Agassiz displayed the Zeile daguerreotypes at a special meeting of the Cambridge Scientific Club held in Agassiz's house on September 27, 1850. And so far as we can tell, no such public exhibit of these objects would occur until after their rediscovery at Harvard more than 120 years later. For this reason, it's difficult to say with any accuracy that the Zeile daguerreotypes themselves influenced scientific theories or visual culture at this time. However, Agassiz's theories, as evidenced in Knott and Gliddon's types of mankind, would certainly travel beyond these images and create a lasting impact in the way non-white subjects were pictured by white artists in the 19th century in the United States. The daguerreotype of Dudu Unquay also reminds us of how power dynamics in the photographer's studio, mediated through the practice of physiognomy, were always present in perhaps more subtle ways when it came to daguerrean portraiture. Sitting in an ill-fitting uniform almost certainly provided to him upon his arrival in Philadelphia, the sitter appears uncomfortable and ill at ease as he sits to be observed by the photographer in the unfamiliar surroundings of a daguerrean studio, much as he would have been observed by the audience at the Academy of Natural Sciences mere blocks away. Both of these images illustrate how the so-called democratic medium of portraiture could be used equally for practices of memorialization as much as it could be turned towards ethnographic examination and used as evidence for pro-slavery efforts. In addition to the daguerreotypes of African-born subjects, this archive also contains images of Asian and Asian American subjects, illustrating how the othering effects of the 19th century's culture of commercial Orientalism intersected with daguerrean portraiture. Posed in a near identical manner to these Zeile images, these two daguerreotypes show us the Chinese performer Puan Yiku. Beginning in the spring of 1850, Puan Yiku appeared as the star of P.T. Barnum's Living Chinese Family, a troupe of 6 performers who staged musical numbers and other demonstrations in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, before traveling to London in 1851 for the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace. A lithograph produced by the New York firm of Currier and Ives illustrates the members of Barnum's troupe, with Puan Yi Ku seated at the far left, pulling a pipa, a 4-string Chinese musical instrument. On stage, Puan Yi Ku performed musical numbers for paying audiences alongside other spectacular technological and natural curiosities that were part of Barnum's show. The images of Barnum's Chinese performance troupe were probably taken in July 1850, when the living Chinese family made an appearance at Boston's Armory Hall, 1 month after the Zealy daguerreotypes were taken. These images of several members of Barnum's performing troupe were taken by Lorenzo G. Chase, a photographer who operated a studio at 257 Washington Street in Boston between 1846 and 1850. Puan Yi Ku's position amongst Agassiz's photographic archive of racial difference marks her image with a desire to see her as an other and to present her simultaneously as an exotic performer from China, as well as a scientific specimen for examination. However, Barnum's Chinese lady may have been born in New York City, possibly the child of a Chinese father and white mother. This possibility was alluded to in a newspaper report of Barnum's show, which remarked that Barnum, quote, is exhibiting several Chinese of the upper 10, as he calls them, who are said to have arrived here a week or two since, but probably have been living for some time past in some obscure part of the city and brought out for the occasion, unquote. At a later performance, one audience member attested to having overheard the Chinese lady speaking in a quote unquote low Yankee slang. If Puan Yi Ku was indeed Chinese American, born and raised in New York, both Barnum's spectacle and Agassiz's daguerreotypes would have functioned as visual disavowals of her national belonging, attesting to how appearing as a diasporic subject could continually undermine her potential citizenship, since prior to the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, those born within the United States were subject to the ruling of each individual state regarding their citizenship status. Her staging among Barnum's living Chinese family therefore rested on an intentional misrecognition of her status as a citizen, a misrecognition that is arguably reproduced in Chase's daguerreotype. To briefly shift our attention to daguerreotype aesthetics, the profile view in particular, which we've seen repeated throughout the daguerreotypes and illustrations used by racial scientists seeking to prove the theory of polygenesis, represents an overlooked convergence of the histories of physiognomic representation and of everyday portrait daguerreotypy. Although many daguerreotypists favored the three-quarter view of a sitter for its ability to mask what were viewed as defects, such as facial blemishes or asymmetries, which could be obscured by turning the sitter's better side toward the camera, the profile view also frequently appears among the repertoires of more mundane studio daguerreotype commissions. John Adams Whipple's self-portrait with his brother provides one early example. Picturing the two siblings side by side, the image demonstrates their morphological similarities, while also providing a kind of visual echo, not unlike a double exposure. In the case of Whipple's daguerreotype, the physiognomic interest in a sitter's facial characteristics is tied to the representation of kinship between siblings, a sharp contrast to the use of the profile view by Agassiz, which he mobilized to illustrate the inherent differences between generalized types. Additionally, as the historian of photography Tanya Sheehan has pointed out, the daguerreotypist Chase also used the profile view in his everyday portrait taking. In a way, then, the sittings of Puan Yi Ku were, for someone like Chase, less exceptional instances of a different kind or scientific way of photographing a subject, and more simply, an extension of the everyday practice of the photographer. In other words, the portrait sittings of the Chinese family were, for Chase, just another day at the studio, in which the sitters were posed and lighted to the most aesthetically pleasing degree suiting the operator's skill. All of these anecdotes suggest how a sitter's appearance was not entirely self-fashioned, and indeed was inevitably judged through the visual culture and prejudices of the moment. Thus far, we've mainly looked at images of non-white sitters taken by white photographers. However, at mid-century, the art of daguerreotypy indeed did democratize the profession of taking portraits in a dramatic way. To explain what I mean, I will return to mid-19th century Philadelphia, which, in addition to being a site of some of the earliest portrait photographs, was also home to one of the largest free Black communities in the country. Throughout the 19th century, the increasing power of the city's multiracial population made for frequent and violent outbursts stemming from racial tensions, as when in 1838, a white mob burned down Pennsylvania Hall, a building that had opened just the day before to serve as a site to discuss abolitionist issues. Yet at the same time, the city's free Black community also thrived and participated in vibrant cultural and political lives, in part visualized by a number of portrait daguerreotypes of free Black sitters produced by both white and Black operated daguerreotype studios. Among the latter was the daguerreotypist and lithographer Robert Douglas Jr., no relation to Frederick Douglass. Born free in Philadelphia in 1809, Douglas was part of a politically active family that had emigrated to the US from the Caribbean and would go on to create a number of significant illustrations on behalf of the city's growing community of abolitionists. To escape the intensifying racial violence in Philadelphia, in July 1839, Douglas traveled to England and France so he could, according to a letter written by Angela Grimke Weld, obtain further instruction and means of improvement in his position as a portrait painter. In June of 1840, the convening of the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London gave Douglas the opportunity to practice his painting skills and to meet prominent abolitionists, including Abby Kelly Foster, who he later daguerreotyped. Records indicate Douglas may have opened a daguerreotype studio in Philadelphia as early as 1843 at 12th and Arch Streets, where he likely took some of the portraits of the Dickersons, an upper middle class African-American family active in politics and arts in the city, as well as a portrait of the Black musician and composer Francis Johnson, a reproduction of which is seen on the right. In addition to Douglas, Glenalvin Goodrich and William C. Goodrich of York, Pennsylvania, both free men of color, owned and operated a daguerreotype studio between 1847 and 1867 before moving to Saginaw, Michigan, where the studio continued to operate until 1922, making it one of the longest continually operating studios in the country. A portrait of a young woman holding a daguerreotype taken around 1853 when the firm still operated in York illustrates the Goodrich's investment in studio props befitting a daguerrean business of the time, including the painted backdrop, cloth-covered table, and the book upon which she props her arm. Similar details can be seen in a fourth plate daguerreotype, likely produced by Douglas Jr., around 1850, in which a Black woman sits against a high-backed chair, one hand and elbow propped upon the accompanying table and book. Her delicate lace collar and cuffs, hoop earrings, a cameo brooch, as well as the detailed fabric of her dress, signal wealth and status above that of the average middle-class sitter. The addition of the book in particular illustrates her literary affinities, significant for a time at which it was still illegal to teach any enslaved African Americans how to read. Her participation in literary culture, as figured in her portrait, can be seen as a political act and a means of making visible her own freedom and personhood. Examples like this illustrate how the daguerreotype studio could act as a place where privileged Black people convened to represent their own emancipation. In this way, the practice of photography also became a way of practicing democracy, or maybe more accurately, a space in which women, free people of color, and other marginalized sitters, otherwise barred from the arena of traditional politics, could picture a different democratic ideal, not yet fully realized beyond the studio. Alternately, when it came to women daguerreotypists operating around the antebellum city, the examples are fewer. According to Sarah Weatherwax, only 16 of the 875 photography workers operating in Pennsylvania between 1839 and 1860 are identifiable as women, working either as camera operators or more commonly as photographic painters. We do know that as early as October 1840, Eliza J. Henry was recorded as one of 5 daguerrean exhibitors at Philadelphia's Franklin Institute, though no specimens produced by her survive. Among those who did take up the medium as operators was Sally Garrett Hughes, a Quaker woman who began working as a daguerreotypist in 1850. The daughter of a Quaker merchant and anti-slavery activist, Hughes was forced to support herself and her 3 children after her husband, who'd been excommunicated from the Quaker community after being accused of adultery, died in 1850 in San Francisco of cholera. Hughes's brother, Elwood, had learned the art of daguerreotyping from Samuel Broadbent at his studio in Wilmington, Delaware in 1849. As Weatherwax has posited, it's possible Hughes learned to daguerreotype either from her brother or from Broadbent herself, but it was with Broadbent that she decided to go into business. After a brief stint in Westchester, by April 1851, Hughes and Broadbent were working together in Philadelphia at an establishment 2 doors down from Marcus Aurelius Root. One of the only portraits that can be confidently attributed to Hughes was made around this time. A double portrait of a man and his wife, pictured in half length against a scenic background. Perhaps due to Hughes's abolitionist connections through her father, Thomas Garrett, in addition to its exceptional status as a multi-gender studio, the Broadbent enterprise in Philadelphia also served a multiracial clientele. In the 1840s, Sally's father, Garrett, had been instrumental in organizing a network of Philadelphians who provided money, transportation, and other assistance to enslaved people who were fleeing the South through the Underground Railroad. Garrett himself is reported to have aided 2,700 enslaved people escape bondage through Pennsylvania and Delaware, and in 1848 faced legal challenges, along with his partner, John Hunn, for helping a family of 8 enslaved people escape northward. That same year, the Broadbent studio photographed the orator and anti-slavery advocate Charles Lennox Redmond. Redmond, hailing from Salem, Massachusetts, had been active in the city's anti-slavery community for many years, including having been an instrumental participant in the first National Colored Convention held in Philadelphia in 1830. By April 1851, Broadbent and Hughes began advertising the business in the abolitionist paper, the Pennsylvania Freeman, under the title Something New, Broadbent and Company, Colored Skylight Daguerreotypes. In a daguerreotype produced by the Broadbent studio around this time, seen here on the left, an African-American woman stands or sits behind a mock window frame with one hand placed upon her chin and the other resting on the ledge, where a trailing vine of grapes and leaves adds a picturesque repoussoir to the portrait. The appearance of the same prop in another full plate daguerreotype of 3 sisters, Caroline, Mary, and Juliana of the Quaker family Wood, indicates to me these images might have been produced in the same studio. In the image on the left, the subtle addition of pink pigment to the sitter's cheeks enhances the liveliness and vivacity of the image. While the addition of subtle pigments to daguerreotype portraits, often by female painters, was very common at the time, as the media historian Jasmine Nicole Cobb has argued, the addition of the pigment to a Black sitter was doubly significant and can be understood as a kind of defiant act and a means of picturing freedom in a venue removed from the cultural logics of slavery. It's as if the rose tinting of her cheeks signifies the enduring vivacity and freedom of the Black subject as self-possessed and self-emancipated. To conclude, I will end with an anecdote from the studio of Broadbent and Hughes, where their commercial space became not only a site of picturing Black freedom, but also a social space where abolitionist activity took place. On July 5th, 1857, Charlotte Fortin, an abolitionist poet and educator, took the time to visit Broadbent's studio. She made note of the visit in her diary, describing how a Miss James was there and showed her the daguerreotype of a young slave girl who escaped in a box. Fortin went on to describe being profoundly moved by the portrait. She says, quote, "My heart was full as I gazed at it, full of admiration for the heroic girl who risked all for freedom, full of indignation that in this boasted land of liberty, such a thing could occur. Were she of any other nation, her heroism would receive all due honor from these Americans. But as it is, there is not even a single spot in this broad land where her rights can be protected. Not one. Oh, how long will this continue?" As Fortin stood in Broadbent's studio, perhaps next to photographic equipment and props, the operating room became more than just a venue to have one's portrait taken. In the exchange of this fugitive image, no doubt closely guarded and rarely displayed so as to protect the girl's identity on her journey northward, the daguerreotype gallery also became a site of community building, and the daguerreotype itself a potential catalyst to political transformation, where gazing upon someone's portrait might inspire empathy, leading the viewer to take action in the support of an anti-slavery cause. Looking at such images alongside accounts of both the scientific and aesthetic innovations American practitioners contributed to the medium, we might look differently at images in photographic archives closer to home. How might we perhaps look on this photograph of an unnamed African-American sitter from the Henry Sheldon collection, likely produced in carte de visite style as an albumen print? With the introduction of the carte de visite and other paper processes, the daguerreotype began to wane in popularity. Albumen and salted paper prints held advantages over the more artisanal daguerreotype, as multiple positives could be reproduced from a single negative, and also were much easier to transport without breaking. In these ways, the paper photograph probably more closely approximates our modern day understanding of what makes photography a democratic medium. With declining prices and the ease of multiple exposures in one sitting, the art of self-representation would continue to expand as members of the working classes could start to obtain multiple likenesses for a reasonable price, allowing for greater experimentation and self-fashioning and representation. So how might we see this image where the sitter, finely dressed in a suit, patterned waistcoat and tie, with his arm elegantly draped over the table and surrounded by the carpet and finery of the studio, is not just a means of securing one's image for posterity, but equally as a means of representing the self as a means of visually participating in American democracy. With so many of the sitters and such images remaining unidentified in many archival collections, some of the answers to these questions must by necessity remain speculative. But at the same time, this image was part of a broader photographic culture, one that required the careful management of social relations and chemical compounds. In these ways, we might understand the photographic portrait to be quote unquote democratic, not merely because it was affordable and widely available, and not merely because it allowed the sitter to pose as he or she saw fit. Rather, we may see photographs as democratic for the ways in which they required collaboration between people, materials, and objects in relational forms that could be continually reformed and reimagined over time, much like the United States itself. So thank you so much for listening. I really look forward to your comments and questions on any part of this presentation. And I also wanted to particularly welcome any archivists or curators or researchers or anyone in the audience who might like to share their own experience around these topics and the archive collections that you work with too. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. This has been fabulous and it's really given us a lot to think about in our own collection, which has a lot of case photographs that we have very little information about, but there are really a lot of politics and power dynamics to explore, regardless of whether we know who the sitters are. So you've given us a lot to think about. We have a couple questions, and actually the first two are Sheldon specific questions that I might pass along to Eva just to provide a little bit of context. So Eva, if you have any thoughts about anything we might know about the portrait of the Black Philadelphia businessman James Fortin that was exhibited at the Sheldon in 2015.
The college.
I don't think it was showed at the Middlebury College. It wasn't shown in our, and it was during an exhibit. I'm sitting here with my husband who actually curated it, so maybe come here and he can answer.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I displayed the James Fortin photograph at a show that I curated at the college called Many Thousand Gone. Yes, and James Fortin is the father of the young lady that you showed in your presentation. And he was a sailmaker. Actually, he was a maker of naval stores in Philadelphia, very wealthy. Made sails, ropes, canvas, other materials for the shipping industry. Yes, as far as we know, that is the one photograph we have of him. There are some questions about whether that actually is him or not, because that photograph was taken at a time when Fortin would have been in his early 70s. And we're not sure if that man was in his early 70s. But the owner of that photograph vouches for its authenticity, that was James Fortin.
Okay, thank you for jumping in, Bill.
Sure.
And this one is for Eva, I promise. Were the Sheldon Museum images that Michelle showed tonight collected by Henry, or do we have a sense that they entered the archive later?
Many of our case photographs, my feeling is they were collected by Henry, but we don't really have that much information. In some cases, information about the subject was somehow lost, and they exist. When I began to work at the Sheldon, they were already separated as a special format, and we don't really know much about provenance. Many of these subjects, though, are identified. So we know the one of the women, young women, who Michelle today showed as part of her lecture. So I can provide this information if you can contact me directly, and I'd be happy to tell you what I know about specific of these people. So,
all right, thank you, Eva. Now back to Michelle. Were there other African-American daguerreotype photographers in other towns and cities around the US?
Yes, very much so. And I think I saw Larry West in the audience. Larry West has an incredible collection of photographs created by Black photographers in the 19th century that recently made its way to the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So that's one place you can go to find these collections. But one photographer in particular was James Presley Ball. who owned a really successful, really prominent studio in Cincinnati in the 1850s and later. And it was also a site where he would display art objects made by African-American artists, some by the landscape painter, Robert Duncanson. You would see those in his gallery, and it was a whole social scene. And he was very actively involved with the abolitionist networks at that time as well. So that's just one example, but there are many others that you could point to. Yes.
All right, and a question from our friend Ellery. Thank you for this illuminating and engaging exploration of early American photography. This calls to mind scholarship on painted representations of different races and skin colors with painterly advice on pigments and how to render light, shadow, blush, and lack thereof. In your research, have you come across discussions of lighting or chemistry specifically pitched to photographers and daguerreotypists?
Yes. And this is something that Tanya Sheehan, who is also up in the Northeast, who's a historian of photography, has written extensively on in her book, Doctored, the Medicine of Photography in the 19th Century. And there's a lot I could say, but I guess the one thing I might say that's really interesting is that some people who might be more familiar with 20th century photography might be familiar with the Shirley cards. So this is like something that companies like Kodak would use to key photographic lighting specifically to white faces. That was considered the standard or the normal thing to try to picture in a photograph. And what's been interesting in my research is seeing how that goes as far back to 1839, when all of the earliest faces seen in daguerreotypes were white. And so lighting was already being keyed to a certain type of skin tone or skin color. It was also interesting, a lot of patent photographs are of white women throughout the 19th century. So there's an interesting, it's kind of a proto-Shirley at this moment. So that's just to say that it became an issue when you would have group photographs that had both black or white or just different skin tones in them, even just slightly darker skin tones among sitters. And so this became an issue, and there were various things you could do to try to avoid it. But then the last thing I would say is that blue lighting was often used. They would often use blue skylights because that was a color that was very sensitive on the Daguerrean spectrum, because the daguerreotype didn't respond to all degrees of the light spectrum equally. So that was another kind of specific cue that was given for photography studios to put kind of a filter on your skylight to get the best possible image. So there's a host of things I could talk about, but I would really point you to Tanya Sheehan's work around this, which is amazing.
All right, and a question about the current status of the Agassi photos at Harvard. Someone says, I hear the descendants of the family has claimed them.
Yeah, Tamara Lanier, who claims to be a descendant of Renty, Papa Renty, that he was known as in their family histories. She has a case moving through the Massachusetts courts. It was dismissed by a lower court judge a couple of months ago, but I think they're going to appeal the decision. And the Agassi photos have, in this way, going through the legal system now that someone is making a claim on owning them and being the rightful owner, so to speak, have provoked a lot of questions around copyright law and how that intersects with the history of slavery, because usually in copyright law, the image is said to belong to the photographer who took it. But in this case, it's pretty clear these images were taken without the consent of the people pictured in them. So it's bringing up all of these questions about, is copyright law going to change when it comes to the history of slavery in the United States? And is this one way to kind of make reparations for the individuals pictured in these photographs? So yeah, keep an eye on the news.
And this idea of the consent or lack of consent on the part of these sitters, I'm curious if these images of non-white subjects became ones that didn't end up in these kind of proto-ethnographical collections, whether they became almost collectible. like images of African American sitters that we have in the Sheldon collection. We have no information attached to them, and we do get the impression that they were something that Henry or a subsequent person at the museum found interesting and purchased, even with this lack of information. And so I'm curious about the ownership and the provenance of these that you've encountered in your research.
A really good question that I might not be the best person to answer. I think there's probably people in the audience right here tonight who are collectors or who are archivists would know the answer to this question. But it is true. I mean, it's interesting to say that you've found them in your archives. I think there's definitely a lot of renewed interest in the past 10 to 20 years, certainly. And I think that, local collections like yours, sort of even more rural collections are interesting places to look for these items, especially when it comes to items, not just of images of people of different ethnicities and races, but also images taken by women. Because as Adrian Lundgren, who's a photography conservator at the Library of Congress, has recently been researching and discovering, is that women were more likely to operate in the Midwest and in more rural settings. So that's where those photographs reside. So there's interesting kind of just contingencies around geography. So that would be the first kind of place to look, I think. But actually, I don't want to say too much because I don't want to misspeak about collecting, because I'm not myself a collector. But often the provenance is very murky. It is true. I think up until recently, a lot of these images were circulating through private collections. And so they haven't been as easy to keep track of as someone who works, a lot with public collections.
All right, and this might be a question for both Michelle and Eva about itinerant photographers and daguerreotype artists in Vermont and maybe even in Middlebury.
No doubt there were definitely itinerant photographers. I'm wondering if Eva knows any more specifics.
Yes, I actually do. I don't recall right now whether we have specific names of these photographers. Actually, I may have. It was a few years ago when we were together with Jim Blair. I curated exhibit at our museum, Our Town, and that's where we displayed number of these early case photographs. I did a lot of research in the local newspapers, and it was very surprising that in very early 1840s in Middlebury, there were already several daguerreotypists, obviously passing by itinerant photographers who were taking these pictures. And some of the cases, and Michelle probably knows much more about that, indicate, the type of cases that these photographs were taken exactly in 1840s. So I'd be happy to answer some more questions directly to a person who is asking these questions, because I even wrote an article for local press about that. So be happy to also share it. So thank you.
All right, and a question about the care and preservation of these images. Michelle, someone in the audience is wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you take care of daguerreotypes.
Oh, I wish I had daguerreotypes. I've been meaning to get some, so I don't actually care for them myself. There's a lot of really great resources online that could speak much more specifically about this. But I'll just anecdotally say, the one thing that did surprise me in the course of learning about 19th century photography was how resistant to fading many daguerreotypes are. It's a very strongly fixed process, but the thing that does degrade the image is air, which is why they had these glass cases that they were put in. So if a daguerreotype has been, out in the world and without its glass case, you probably are going to see a lot more effects like spotting on the plate and things like that, and also scratches. You don't want to be touching the surface because it really relies on that really fine mirrored polish. If you've ever held a daguerreotype, you've probably had the experience of trying to hold it at the right angle so you can actually see the image and not a reflection of yourself looking back in it. So not touching the image, of course. But yeah, again, I'm not a chemist, but there are people who specialize in 19th century photographic conservation who could, if you have daguerreotypes, who you should probably consult with.
All right. And another question about collecting. When did art museums start collecting these kinds of images? I mean, when did they become art objects in a museum sense?
That's a great question. I mean, when do they become art objects? I mean, it happened much, much later than you might expect. I don't think it was until the 1930s at the Museum of Modern Art until they had their first curator of photography till the late 1930s and their first exhibit of photographs as a kind of, part of an art museum, being an art exhibit and actually having to make the case for photographs as art. I do believe in that 1939 exhibit, there were a couple of daguerreotypes shown, but it wasn't, I would say, until even after that mid 20th century moment that art museums in particular. Now, of course, historical museums have had these kinds of cased images in their collections for much, much longer. They're collected as being a part of the history and culture of a place. Often when families donate their papers, there's going to be, if their family line goes back to the 19th century, there is going to be daguerreotypes of family members that come along with those collections. So they've been doing this much longer than art museums. But it wasn't until maybe the later 20th century, in the 1980s, 1990s, maybe, that daguerreotypes were entering museum collections, maybe even later than that. And one way to figure this out is look at an art museum's collections on their database or website and see what the accession date is. And that'll tell you when they start collecting certain objects.
All right. And one final question about the more like the process of having a daguerreotype portrait taken. I mean, what was the atmosphere like in these studios? Was it kind of a social event to have your portrait taken? Was it kind of a clinical, you disappear into a dark room with the photographer?
Well, it could be both of those things, actually. The room generally is very light and not dark when you go to get your portrait taken, but the dark room is dark. But yes, so I mean, it's going to really depend on the studio. So someone brought up itinerant photographers. Well, there you're just having your photograph taken, wherever they're setting up shop. People who were itinerant photographers often did multiple things. They were also sign painters or mechanics. And so this was just part of how they were making money. So you could set up shop in someone's yard and be doing it for the day, and that's your studio. In really, really early cases, like with Cornelius, who I talked about, that's a very early moment, 1840 to 1843. So the studio is going to be a little more rudimentary. It's usually going to be located on the top floor of the building because that's where the skylight is, and that's where you can get the most light and to get the best looking photograph. But then by around 1850, you get these professionals, and this is, itinerants still exist, but this is just a different class of photographer where they have a very luxurious parlor where you come in and you can kind of browse, almost like an art gallery, kind of the work of the photographer you would be going to see. And so that's sort of the first receiving room on the first level. And then usually you'd go up to a higher level of the building to then have your portrait taken. So those were separate spaces in a studio, like Matthew Brady, for example, what have you. So yes, it could be many things at once, but there often were, there's funny descriptions of receiving rooms of daguerreotypists in around 1850 with things like singing birds in cages and, stained glass and, a piano with, a pretty lady twinkling out a tune to like kind of set the mood. So you have like a good face on for your portrait to be taken. Yes.
All right. And I think one final question here, what piqued your interest in this field, Michelle?
Oh, thank you for that question. I've been, I hesitate to say how long I've been studying daguerreotypes because it would probably make it sound like I should know more, but there's always so much more to learn. But when I was an undergraduate, it was really just going to, it was in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And the curator at the time there introduced me to this collection of Civil War photographs of soldiers from the 1860s, many of which were unidentified and uncatalogued at the time, but it was actually seeing how these photographs were just these incredible objects that often had, you know, notes attached to them and bits of hair attached to them as kind of these sentimental mementos. And I found it incredibly moving. And I've been thinking about 19th century photography since then, really. So that may have been it.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of our evening then. Thank you so much, Michelle. This has been really incredible. And thank you everyone for joining us for the first Elephant in the Room talk of 2022. And we hope to see you same time, same place next month to learn about maps. So have a wonderful Wednesday night, everyone.